As part of the Restless Earth tectonic units, we looked at a case study of a volcanic eruption, and specifically at Iceland and the volcanic eruption that took place in 2010. We thought about the causes of that volcanic eruption, the effects, and in thinking about the effects we looked at primary, secondary effects, and also tried to classify those in terms of social, economic, environmental impacts. And then we started looking at the responses, both short-term and long-term. Okay, so we'll kick off by thinking about the causes of the eruption. It's important to remember that Iceland lies on the mid-Atlantic ridge. Okay, so we'll make a note of that, the mid-Atlantic ridge, which is in fact a constructive plate margin. Okay, so we'll indicate that by showing that our plates are moving apart, and the two plates were the Eurasian and the North American plate. So as the convection currents pulled those two plates apart, that led to lava escaping to the surface of the Earth, causing the eruption. Now, in the case of the 2010 eruption, it was quite a dramatic and violent eruption that lasted for about 2 months, off and on. Okay, so as with the other case studies we've looked at, we can start thinking about the effects and the responses, but also looking at those in a bit more finer detail, because you will get credit for classifying and be able to group your ideas into primary, so things that were short term, and secondary, and in terms of our responses, in terms of short term and long term. So that means that we can start dividing our diagram up into our 4 quadrants as normal. So some of the most immediate effects of the eruption were that people had to be evacuated out of that area, and in fact about 800 people were evacuated from the immediate area around the Iceland volcano. There was a huge amount of ash that came out of that volcano, and as it fell down to earth, it actually the land, it actually led to the contamination of the local water supplies with huge amounts of fluoride. Okay, so that meant that the water supply couldn't be used. We also know that the crops were covered in ash, which meant that the crops that were growing were completely lost. And they were damaged by the heavy falls of ash, and we know that that will in fact weather down and make the soil very fertile, but in the immediate aftermath of the volcano, the volcanic eruption, it means those crops are destroyed and the land can't be used. Homes, obviously people were evacuated with the area, but a huge amount of homes were covered in ash, and the electricity supplies were cut off for large numbers of people. Okay, so those are some of the immediate effects. In terms of the knock-on impacts of the lava and ash that was emitted from the volcano, the ash actually led to the damage of the aircraft engines, and so for that reason all flights in Europe, so not just around the immediate area of the volcano, but all flights in Europe were actually cancelled for a period of 8 days. Okay, so that's about 100,000 flights were cancelled, and it's estimated that this led to a loss of money for the airline industry in the region of £80 million, so huge economic cost to that. The impacts of this were felt as far afield as Kenya, who rely very much on exporting their agricultural products, such as tomatoes, to the important markets in Europe. And because they couldn't transport their goods by air freight, a huge amount of business was lost for these kinds of countries. So in Kenya, farm workers lost their jobs or suffered pay cuts because their fresh produce, such as flowers, beans, tomatoes, as I said, were unable to be flown to European supermarkets. In sport, a number of international events were also affected by this flight ban. Okay, so we can put sports. Okay, events were affected. And this included the Japanese motorcycle Grand Prix. So we can have a little motorcycle here of some sort. Okay, so that was a Japanese motorcycle Grand Prix. You also had the French Rugby League teams competing in the Challenge Cup, so we'll draw some kind of rugby ball there, but it was also the Boston Marathon. Okay, so it's not just about the competitors not being able to take part in these, but there's a huge amount of money lost as people rely on this for their business. Now, because there was a travel ban to Iceland, indeed the whole of Europe, tourism in Iceland was really badly affected. So we could put tourism in Iceland went down as people were unable to travel. And we know about our positive multipliers and actually how big an impact that would have. One of the biggest problems, one of the biggest secondary effects of the eruption was the flooding. Now, as the eruption occurred beneath the glacier on top of the volcano, a huge amount of meltwater was produced because of the high temperatures. So we'll indicate that with a little symbol for flooding. Okay, and that was one of the biggest secondary impacts. This meltwater rushed down the side of the volcano. Vast torrents of water flowed out from underneath the ice. Okay. In terms of the responses, we've already talked about the evacuation of people from the immediate area. Because there was a huge amount of ash in the atmosphere, rescuers actually had to wear face masks to protect themselves from that very harmful ash that was in the air as it fell back down to earth. Now we talked about the meltwater that was being produced by the melting glacier. Now that obviously led to the rivers overflowing, and one thing that they did in the immediate aftermath is they actually, if I do a little cross section of the rivers, okay, these swollen rivers, as the river level rose, were in real danger of washing away bridges that were across the river. So what they did was they actually took the decision to breach the embankment. So they made holes in the sides of the river so the water could come out and actually flood over agricultural land which wasn't that high a value, so protecting the bridges. Okay, so that was a decision that was made. So the embankments were breached in order to save those bridges which cost millions of pounds to build, and it was deemed more satisfactory that the less valuable agricultural land was sacrificed. We also know that the London Volcanic Ash Advisory Centre gave 24-hourly updates in terms of that ash cloud and monitored it very closely and fed that information to the whole of Europe in terms of its progress. We've talked about the flight bans, so you couldn't travel by air during this period. In terms of more long-term responses, well, there was a huge investment of money into the impact of ash on the airline industry. Okay, so we were better informed for future events. They also much more detailed seismic stations across Iceland now in order to monitor the tectonic activity that was taking place and try and give early warning to people. Okay. Now, it wasn't all bad, obviously. In terms of volcanic eruptions, we can think about some positives. So we put a little box down here for our positives. Obviously, tourism, more recently, has actually enjoyed a real upsurge because of the marketing that the Iceland Tourist Board is doing. And actually, the area is now advertised as the land of fire and ice. And lots of tourists now visit Iceland to see the volcano. and that's obviously increasing business and providing lots of job opportunities. We spoke earlier about the ash that has covered the crops, and although that is a problem in the short term, in the long term that ash actually weathers down and makes the soil extremely fertile for farming. So agriculture gets a benefit.